Germany had adopted the excellent Mauser 1898 infantry rifle, and just a few years later they would see further improvements, though these would be exported around the globe. One of the earlier adopters would be the Ottoman Empire. Hi, I'm Othais, and over the next couple shortened episodes, we're going to get a look at a number of export Mausers. But today we're starting with this one, the Ottoman 1903. This is a beautiful and rare piece, so thank you, John, for lending it to us so that we can put it straight over into the light box. At 49 inches in length and weighing in at a whopping 9.2 pounds, this is a full-sized heavy infantry rifle. It has a 5-round staggered box magazine that feeds from a stripper clip. The cartridge is, of course, the 7.65 by 53mm Belgian Mauser cartridge, as used by the Ottoman Empire. In the last two episodes, we saw the development of the German Mauser Gewehr 98. And as production got under control for the native Germany, Mauser Oberndorf would seek to further sales abroad. One regular customer, of course, was the Ottoman Empire, who up until this point had bought one of every repeating Mauser design, leaving off with their own unique magazine cutoff version of the Mauser 1893, although their first smokeless had been all the way back at the 1890. Along with it, they had adopted the 7.65 Mauser cartridge, one also favored in Belgium and certainly an excellently balanced military cartridge. 7.65 has a unique short case length and allows for what many call intermediate Mausers with shorter receiver lengths and therefore shorter bolt throws. Well, when you've adopted all but one Mauser, why not go that extra step? In previous episodes, we've covered the long adoption process for the 1887, and then the swap over to the more modern 1890, and the new interest in the very advanced 1893, but there's surprisingly little out there that I know of covering why the Ottomans went for this particular gun. Most likely they were motivated by material losses in the Greco-Turkish War of 1897. This conflict was an Ottoman martial victory, but a Greek diplomatic one, resulting in the autonomy of Crete. It did, however, prove the effectiveness of German military planning as provided by Kolmar Freiherr von der Goltz. The better equipped, trained, and more numerous Ottoman troops easily overran the Greeks. Concurrent to and extending past the Greco-Turkish War was the Macedonian struggle, a situation in which Ottoman Macedonia was split between cultural unity with Bulgaria or Greece. The Turks would prefer neither, of course, but no one was listening, so they would need more rifles. Now, as to what type? Well, some sources say the call was made by Hüseyin Tevfik Pasha, and while he was a recurring member of the Ottoman Rifle Commission and visited Germany, and is known in mathematics circles for his book Linear Algebra, he died in 1901, and to my knowledge the orders to make this purchase came in 1902. Regardless of who made the call, the old empire was buying a new rifle in 1903, making it the model 1903 in collector's eyes, though the rifles are crested with their exact year of manufacture in the Rumi calendar. Well, when the dates are present, there is at least one plain commercial crest variation and several Ottoman, depending on the contract. These dates can be roughly converted to the Gregorian by adding 584 years. And that's really it. There's not a lot of workup on this gun because we've already seen the design, and there's not a lot known about why it was adopted other than that they needed more rifles. So we can go ahead and skip the line and get a look at the gun up close and personal. All right, look at this guy. Starting at the rear, we have a metal butt plate coming into a semi-pistol grip stock rear sling swivel rolling forward, the familiar Mauser 98 action. And if we keep coming forward to that, we've got a full wraparound, well not full, but a wraparound upper handguard. We've got a tangent rear sight. And if we keep coming on, our handguard ends here at the mid band. This band is actually incorrect for this rifle. It would be a little simpler than this, but I think we'll give it a pass for now. And we'll roll on forward into a much earlier 1893 style bayonet lug, clearing rod and front sight. So this should all seem pretty standard Mauser-y to you guys. Nothing super terrific. I do want to point out though that it is very beautifully crested. Look at that. Now you've probably seen shots of this scrolled out before in this episode, but Isn't that beautiful? Translation on this can be a little difficult though. I've seen some disagreements there because this uses an older form of the script and an older form of the Ottoman/Turkish language. There's a whole linguistic history that I don't want to get into today, but basically this is not modern Turkish. Now, if I bring it to the rear sight, we'll see that it is a tangent rear, but let's take a look. Let's try the Mauser test that we're so used to. One. Oh, hey. Alternating 50-meter clicks. This has the same advantages of the Gewehr 98 without that big old roller coaster sight. I love that system when you can find it. And then if we look to the rear, you guys are gonna see, and it might not be easy to realize at first, but let me get this sideways and lined up for the camera. Look at how tall this stripper clip bridge is. This really stands up. Now, the reason for that is because, and this is just an arbitrary stripper clip, it doesn't go to this gun necessarily. You see these 3 indentations on the clip. These were added, they were not originally part of Mauser's design, and since the Ottomans were using stripper clips all the way back on the 1890, they did not initially have these dimples that helped bite and hold on as you loaded the gun. And so they had a taller bridge with a supporting, see this finger right here, a supporting finger. That is our bolt release, applying pressure to the stripper clip. You can see this on Belgian 89s and Ottoman 1890s and rifles of that family. Now you can also see that it still has the dimple cuts for being able to use dimples like these. So in other words, this gun can use either. Now the one thing you will notice though, is that when you try to feed it a stripper clip, it doesn't really want to drop straight in. As a matter of fact, you kind of have to push it over and drop it in if you're using the dimples. Now, the original clips, I do not have one. They may have fit straight away, but I have a feeling no, this is designed to keep some of that tension in there to make it backwards compatible. So very unique, stands out very clearly on the gun. Otherwise, this is a really standard Mauser 98 pattern rifle, nothing fancy. There's no reinforcing lug in the stock because of the lighter shooting 7.65 cartridge. There's really no finger grooves, nothing. It's almost featureless except for that beautiful cresting and that unique stripper clip bridge. Now, just because these guns are extremely excruciating rare, you can still see this feature on converted ones that were rechambered and reconfigured for 7.92 in the 30s. So it may be very common for you to see something like this clip bridge sticking up very tall like that. That is an obvious sign that that gun was formerly one of these very tidy 1903s. All right, believe it or not, we are already this quickly ready to let Mae try out this gun. I don't know, kind of looked like a marked improvement over the base Gewehr 98, but we'll let Mae give her opinion at the end of all this. So let's talk what we do know, something about numbers. The original contract was for 200,000 rifles, which is pretty much the same count for every previous model that the Ottomans have adopted. The price was 315 kuros a pop. The following year, a contract was let out to the Ottoman Navy. I've seen claims ranging from 400 to 1,000 rifles in either case. That's pretty rare. The next large order seems to have come in 1907 for the Macedonian Gendarmerie, another 7,617 guns. 30,000 carbines were also produced, split evenly between artillery and cavalry. The big difference is in the sling and swivel positions, and I've heard the inclusion of a cleaning rod or a pull-through. These are generally known as the Model 1908. The carbines are unfortunately exceptionally rare, and I actually weirdly owned one at one point, completely sporterized. The proprietary rear sight was long gone, the stock was cut, it was a huge mess. But back then, I didn't have the means to restore it, and it was one of the things I actually sold to gear up for this show. Every collector has his regrets. Another batch of long rifles were sold in 1910 or 1911, 1,100 of them, and they are commercially marked by Oberndorf, very plain in appearance. This was most likely because they came after the Young Turk Revolution. I've heard these were cited for the new Spitzer cartridge, but I've sadly been unable to confirm that difference. Finally, an unknown number of customs rifles have turned up. These have a unique and more modern crescent marking and may also be post-Sultan. Not much is really known for sure. You would think that the Model 1903 would have a strong presence in the Balkan Wars, but the Ottoman tradition of keeping the best stuff close at home meant that very few, if any, were present in the far-flung edges of the empire, so the 1903 wasn't really influential at that point. Now, before I talk about actual combat, I have to introduce another somewhat surprising Mauser rifle, and one I sadly don't have here, but we should get some context. This is the Gewehr 98 as adopted by Germany, and if you saw a recent episode on it, you'll know that our Ottoman 1903 today really resembles the rifle that Mauser actually wanted to sell the German army. And this is a Paraguayan Mauser 1907, which apparently reverted to the German pattern. I sadly don't have one of those today either, but I just wanted to mention it briefly. Paraguay ordered 7,600 of these long rifles in 7.65 in 1907. It's a tongue twister. These were bought at Mauser Oberndorf. Again, because of the 7.65, the receiver could be a bit shorter, but otherwise they were just like the standard issue Gewehr 98. In 1913, Paraguay came back for more, ordering 10,100 this time. They were to ship in one large lot, but that was interrupted when war were declared. Germany locked out of exporting arms to foreign powers and bought up the remaining stock from Mauser. The intermediate receiver length made the Paraguayans unsuitable for conversion to 8mm Mauser, or 7.92x57, and so they were passed on as aid to somebody who did use 7.65, the Ottoman Empire, who had a small problem. They hadn't completely come around to bridged clips, as we saw earlier, so the Paraguayans would have to be modified slightly to be compatible with all of the available ammunition clips. A lengthened clip guide was screwed in place, allowing the easy use of smooth-sided or ridged stripper clips. That's pretty neat, right? Hardly front line, so we won't sweat not having one in the shop today, but still pretty cool to know about. Both the 1907 and the much more common 1903 did serve in the Great War. The guns, to my knowledge, elicited no complaints. They are certainly extremely rugged and reliable Mauser designs, but most today have been lost. Both the 1903 and the 1907, and well, every other Ottoman smokeless Mauser, would go through a massive conversion process in the 1930s. The 1903 actually became the basis for the rest of the guns, however, now in 7.92 and featuring that German stock ferrule for taking down the bolt. These updates were pretty dang universal, and so the examples we have of pre-conversion guns like this one are usually captures from the Balkan region or even maybe from British action, which, considering you have to boat it out of there, not a lot of these laying around. This is super rare stuff. I'm very glad to be loaned this piece. Now technically, this is a whole episode right here on this gun. It's just a really short one because of how little we do know. So I'm going to do something new. Instead of just shoehorning in another rifle, I'm going to release this mini episode as part of a pair and title each out accordingly so you know what you're watching. So don't be disappointed. Just look for the next rifle in the series right about now. But before you do, let's go talk to Mae. All right, once again, we've made room for Mae, and we still have our beautiful and alluring Ottoman 1903 Mauser. Let me get that in your hands. Now this gun's a bit of an odd duck because it's what you would consider to be very closely related to the export Mausers that we're going to talk more about later. But it's early. Like the Mexican 1902, this gun, they are very early, cleaned up versions of the Mausers that resemble prototype Mausers. How does this gun, which is a very unusual gun that most people are not going to encounter, how does it feel to you, Mae, ergonomically?
Okay, so nothing super unusual here. I mean, it's got a good bit of length to it. It's got a good bit of weight to it. Balance is shifted a little bit further forward, so I just need to make sure that I definitely put my fingers all the way up under the rear sight back here. Unfortunately, no grasping grooves. That would be a little bit nicer to have those there, but hey, I do have a full handguard up here, which is kind of nice. I would think especially after that previous episode where I'm having to handle the Gewehr 98 and shooting 25 rounds out of it, the heat on that one started to get to be a bit much. So with this one here, no matter how many rounds I'm shooting out, I can handle this one all day long.
Well, you had handguard up there on the Gewehr 98. It's more about that
down
critical,
here,
super thick rear section. That's where you can start to hold a hot gun.
You don't think it makes a lot of difference, but it really does, because when you're grabbing it quickly, you tend to grab towards the middle or where the balance is, and that's where the balance is at. It was perfectly placed, I thought.
Yeah, the rear sights can carry a little heat through because it's metal on metal. But again, I actually like that ridge. And they have a groove carved down the center for the sight line. I can set my thumb in there, get a hold of it. I'm at the center point of the rifle and move.
Yeah, weirdly, that is kind of a nice little notch right there that you can put your fingers around. It's pretty good.
All right, what else we got?
So I would honestly say from there, let me get into the action a little bit. I did notice, like the Gewehrs, it's pretty smooth. It feels pretty good. I'm definitely enjoying that. It feels, interestingly, very well supported. And I didn't talk about this enough when I was talking about the Gewehr 98. Of course, that kind of felt the same. Where back here, there's a little bit of wiggle, but notice, even if I put pressure down or to the left or to the right, I can still push this bolt forward relatively easily. It still feels smooth.
It's very hard to bind it. So
Yes.
A lot of these front lug locking guns especially, you can torque up and down on them by accident unconsciously, and they bite in. And so like
That has happened before to me.
Oh yeah, and then you see things like Carcano where they have like sort of rounded lugs to prevent a lot of that, you know?
Mm-hmm. Now I do feel if some mud and muck got in here, yeah, that might make things a little more difficult. Then again, we don't really do those kind of mud tests, so how this would do in a muddy version versus maybe a Carcano in a muddy version versus how it is normally, then we get into some tricky territory.
Well, there's a lot more surface area. So the trade-off for having the bolt supported, because as you move that bolt back and forth, you got the extractor supporting it, you got this guide lug supporting it. At various times, the left lugs are there's all these pieces of metal that are tracing along with other pieces of metal in order to keep it from moving off that center axis, okay? For all that engagement, you also drive up the amount of binding force. So if any of you have dealt with old guns that have been sprayed with like WD-40, which is a water displacer and not really a lubricant, and then it attracts dust and gunk, and then you get to it years later, and if you get to a Carcano that's been soaked in WD-40 and you go to open it, it's pretty terrible feeling, but not that much more terrible than a normal Carcano. And yet with a Mauser, since they have such smooth, heavily engaged surfaces, they almost feel like they're glued shut, but the minute you get that lubricant moving again, they feel very smooth and very supported. So I think sometimes we need to understand that there's a difference between a supported action and a smooth action, or a supported and smooth action versus an unbound action, an action that has lower friction in it overall. So in a lot of ways, as much as the Carcano feels terrible as a sporting rifle, since it has lower surface engagement, it might be less prone to gunking down depending on what is on it.
This is true. So it's possible just the difference or the gap that it may create, mud versus no mud, might not be quite as steep. Whereas in this one, it might be pretty significant.
Yeah, it comes down to a lot of little design details that we don't chase out because we don't do mud testing on very exotic and rare guns. Or even some of the more common ones because it's just not our field. But I know that there's some other people out there that you could probably yell at to do that kind of thing for you. But in the long run, we do know as collectors that this is more WD-40 susceptible, which is a test I can verify myself because I see a lot of WD-40.
It is quite unfortunate. And speaking of design details, one more thing I wanted to mention about the action of the bolt. I did notice the handle right here. It feels different. It almost has like a plum-like shape. It feels like a cross between an Arisaka and a standard Mauser bolt handle. It's not quite round. It's more, it's got an oblongness to it.
Yeah,
almost.
it's like a tulip shape.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And I don't know that that is any mechanical advantage whatsoever, but it's very nice looking.
Yeah, it feels nice. You don't notice it until I guess it just feels a little bit smaller and a little more plum-like. Different. Yep. And then honestly, this clip bridge. So this to me is probably one of the biggest unique features of this gun just because it sits so tall for one, so that is different. And I do like how pronounced it is, how far it does stick up. My only concern is we didn't have original Turkish stripper clips on range, so we can't tell how smooth this would have been with those. But I know for me, I had to make sure to depress this to the side in order to properly strip the rounds off. If I didn't push it aside, there were going to be some issues with feeding there on that one.
Yeah, I have held the ammo up, and there's a margin in there where there may be a clip design that you don't have to push that aside. I'm not certain. I have not gotten a hold of the original clips. I have not gotten exact measurements of the original clips. I suspect that more often than not, you did have to have that hand motion of sort of pushing it a little bit aside,
like tipping a little bit to the left, push to the side, and then push down. Don't get me wrong. Once it's seated well, but you do need to make sure it actually does seat properly.
But every time you add a fine motor control function to a military rifle, and not just every time you add one, but the finer the motor control, the worse it gets.
It slows the user down.
However,
I agree.
I like how they present themselves. They're very tall.
Yes.
So in a way, it's like a Mauser and like a Lee Enfield mixed because you have these very tall, you have a very high set point to set the clip down on, but then it's much narrower, and that's sort of the big problem.
That's
now,
right.
An example of a stripper clip that's high and wide would be like the Ross, but I found those to be atrocious to load because it's too high and too wide, and there was a lot of slop.
The Steyr-Hahn had a pretty high pronounced stripper.
Yeah, as a pistol?
Yeah. That was different.
That's actually kind of interesting. That would be a little bit more like a Steyr-Hahn pistol almost in terms of loading.
Makes me think of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, realistically, the last thing I really wanted to talk about this one, I mean, aside from some of the more obvious features, decent comb height, semi-pistol grip, yes, positive there, but this tangent leaf sight, hey, we've still got your depress and
the rock one,
forward.
rock one.
Yes, so we have it, and I'm terrible about using it because it's not something I've practiced obviously a lot on range.
Being down in the low country of South Carolina, we're lucky to get 100 yards that we can see, let alone 1,000.
Yes, but it is kind of nice that I don't have those big Longovisier sights that are blocking my vision. They're nice and flat, easy to read, tall enough so they're decent, and I haven't lost that feature that I think is actually good for walking your shots in. Granted, again, I didn't have to use it, but a nice feature to have.
It's interesting to me because you could always hit both buttons and walk up and down the sight as far as you want, which is what later Mausers tend to do universally. But I can also just hit one button and make a 50-meter adjustment.
Yes.
I like that a lot, and ever since I've discovered it, I find it to be probably... I always like tangent rear sights as probably the best non-aperture sights, you know? Now that I know that they had this one button walk up and down, even when you start getting into aperture sights, that's a feature that I really wish was more common. And you'll see the US almost kind of doing something similar in the fact that with like later Garens and stuff like that, it's like a reel that you just click, click. And being able to control in incremental ways is what tends to be more useful when you're trying to deal with adjustments on the fly in a battlefield.
All right, so theoretically, I can see this being a very useful feature, just not one we had to use. And speaking of a feature of not really having to use on site.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was almost going to forget the bayonet lug. Granted, we never really have to ever, practice using it, and I think at some point we're going to need to try it out just for the sake of it.
We actually get this comment a lot, why don't we do bayonets? So the 1903 is a good example of this. It had a standard infantry bayonet that it released with, but then by the time of the war, the Ottomans were converting whatever. And they would take Greek stuff and convert it. And then post-war, the Turkish bayonet conversions are all over the place. Bayonets are an art and science in and of themselves and require level research that honestly is not always present in the reference materials that we pull for the guns. And so the hard truth is, as much as I would like to talk more about the bayonet accessories, one, the research would easily double the research period per episode and we would not be able to release in time.
Right.
And two, sourcing the actual pieces is extremely difficult because those are still collectible in many countries, whereas guns are usually only collectible either in certain countries or with a lot of expense in certain countries. And so bayonets make it further afield from us, whereas being in the US, we have a lot of access to at least the firearms.
Right.
And so it can get a little tricky.
Yep, the only thing I can really comment is that it just appears like this one doesn't really seem to have a lot of surface area for a lot of grasping.
It's not just that. This is what I always sort of say is the 1893 style, but it even goes back to the Belgian Mausers and stuff. But it has this cantilever spring lock here, and it has this simple T-shaped grasp here, and then it uses the ring. So the muzzle ring is going to cause us to have barrel harmonics issues whether it's mounted or not.
Right.
It's going to lock pretty strongly, don't get me wrong, these are usable locks, but over the years, you tend to notice that as these guns wear out, there's a lot of damage that starts to appear right here with this spring surface that attaches this front band.
Yeah.
And so overall, looking at guns that have aged poorly, I favor the later, it's before this gun, but the 98 deep I-beam looking lug. That lug tends to stand the test of time a lot better.
And I'm based off of what I'm picturing in my head, probably doesn't interfere with the harmonics of the rifle either.
Right, well that's designed specifically so that you don't have to have a muzzle ring.
Nice. Okay, cool. So yeah, feature-wise, it's still a little bit awkward and heavy, but love the sight, love the bolt, love the action. Everything about that was fantastic.
Okay, and it has your semi-pistol grip.
Yes. Woohoo.
So that means when you go to pull the trigger, how does that feel?
All right, yep, so sights are decent. We've covered that. I go to pull the trigger. I can pull this deep into my shoulder with that semi-pistol grip. Fantastic. And the recoil was actually very nice. That 7.65 cartridge didn't really feel like much in this gun. It almost felt like it didn't fit it, which is unusual. I just didn't expect the recoil to be as light as it was. It was not light, don't get me wrong. It was more like in between light and medium.
No, 7.65 is a beautiful cartridge for like a short rifle. This is a long rifle, and so it's almost unnecessary. I'm sure you get a lot of accuracy out of it, or precision.
Well, I mean, I did pretty decent on it. I mean, my spread wasn't too bad on this one. I think I did like top left shoulder.
No, but the problem is at the range we fight, a lot of that walkout is not the gun. A lot of that walkout is the weight of the gun. I almost feel like you could take this exact gun and shorten it up by a third, and you would have a better grouping at combat distances.
Well, I did shoot this one after firing the Gewehr in this wonderful trench mag attachment.
That was a long day of firing full-powered cartridges in heavy rifles.
But even that being said, I still hit all my shots on target, and it was still a decent grouping for that. So
you're gonna have a beefy left arm.
Oh yeah.
Just the left.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's what guys are into. Beefy left arms.
Beefy left arms.
Yeah. So here's the thing. If it seems like we're struggling to talk about details on this gun, that's because it's mold making in a lot of ways.
And that's a good way to put it. It really doesn't feel like, aside from some of the more unique features like this clip bridge or the tangent sight change up from that Gewehr 98, the Longa-Visier, like there really aren't a lot of major distinctive features.
But it's important to know that this is the first gun that we've got in our hands that is very close to what Paul Mauser recommended to the German army, and they ultimately made slight adjustments. They didn't keep the wraparound handguard. They didn't keep the tangent rear sight. They did their own thing, but otherwise took his advice. And so it feels like an incremental change from the Gewehr 98, but actually the Gewehr 98 is an incremental change from this. This predates it in a lot of ways. This is Paul Mauser's vision for his gun, minus this weird clip bridge and a couple other little tiny things, and with a different bayonet lug. Although his reinforced bayonet lug is not that one, nor is it the one that the German army adopted. He thought of it a totally different system.
Right.
But otherwise, we are very close to his vision. And in that regard, this is mold making, and therefore everything that this gun ends up looking very plain, and the guns that are related to it look very plain because we see it as ubiquitous, because it ends up being such a good idea that it's everywhere. And so we start to celebrate the things that don't look like this, but things that wander too far away from this pattern are things that actually don't work, because this pattern ended up working very, very, very well for a number of years.
Yes.
Other than accept the length. I think the length is the one lesson that could have been learned.
Which unfortunately didn't, but that's okay.
Yeah, but again, it's an easy adjustment though, and otherwise a home run.
Yes. Otherwise it was beautiful.
Right. So I guess with all that pumping up, would you take something like this into battle is kind of a bad question to ask now, but let's go ahead and knock it off.
Are you kidding me? This gun was fun. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's got its little quirks with it, but I can totally understand how this was Mauser's rifle that he wanted to pursue. That was his dream, because there are a lot of pros with this one, and it feels solid even after all the beating that it's taken over the years. I loved it a lot.
Yeah, this is taking a reliable action and making incremental changes for the sake of improvement. If you want to see a gun that had a lot of incremental changes for the sake of improvement, but it was all sort of necessity-based, that's something like the Lee Enfield Mark III. You start to see lots of little changes added on willy-nilly. Not willy-nilly, but it's in response to problems. Mm-hmm. And then you see like the number 4, the World War II pattern, where they really go nuts trying to solve these problems. The leap between the Mauser 1893 and the Mauser 1898 family of guns is the same leap between the Lee Enfield Mark III and then the number 4. Like, it's that here are the hard problems with this system, the things that are limiting it, and we're going to make these adjustments. And so I know they seem small from the outside, but they're very thoughtful changes that are supposed to make the supreme military rifle out of a good platform. And I think it comes through. It's hard. You'd be hard-pressed to get a no from either of us on any Mauser 98 pattern rifle. What could you really do to make it terrible?
It would have to be something that was catastrophically wrong with the rifle itself, but that wouldn't have made it past the line.
Yeah, imagine destroying the ergonomics of the sighting or something so much that that action and its inherent precision and other positives was so depleted.
It would have to be quite substantial. It really would.
I'm up for the challenge. Somebody tell me if you know of a 98 that's just that terrible. But no,
well, not that's that terrible, and that somebody like hasn't real time been the one to make
don't
it
go
that terrible.
Bubba a
No.
98 just to make it unusable.
Right, we're talking about something that was originally done to the piece.
Well, I took the rear stock off and I replaced it with a solid steel spike so that it embeds yourself in your shoulder.
Well, it's really to make it safe. It's to make sure you're using it safe.
Well, you don't want to,
You don't want to push it too far into
what's
your
a little
shoulder.
pain for being able to point it in the right...
But if it goes through the shoulder, it ain't going anywhere. It's definitely not coming off that shoulder.
Yeah, you put your eye close to the sight, too.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, with all that covered in gory detail, I think we're done. So, as always, stay after the credits for an update, and have a good one.
Bye, guys.
Since this episode was one of a pair, well, really, you just need to tune in to the next episode. No update, guys.